Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Little Sleepies. So, some of you might know I'm a parent. I've got 2 kids, and man, when you first become a parent, there's a lot to learn. And one of the things that I had no idea about was children's clothing. People end up giving you a lot of hand-me-down clothes that may or may not work for your kid, and people seem to have lots of opinions about what kind of stuff your kid should be wearing. But when you find a company like Little Sleepies, it can make your life a whole lot easier. Little Sleepies makes children's clothes for bedtime and playtime, so your kids can stay stylish and comfy 24/7. The company was created by real moms who understand the realities of daily life with kids. The clothes are made with super soft, comfortable fabrics that actually hold up, and they fit 3 times longer than other brands. On top of that, the thoughtful details in these clothes make everyday dressing and diaper changing a breeze. If you're expecting or dressing little ones, then check out Little Sleepies. You can visit littlesleepies.com and use promo code GOODNIGHT, that's all caps, GOODNIGHT, for 10% off your first order. We should start with the box, because once the box entered the picture, it never truly left. It was a specially built wooden packing crate, 3 feet 1 inch long, 2 feet 6 inches deep, and 2 feet wide. That did not give our man much space. Henry Brown was a well-built gentleman who stood nearly 6 feet tall and weighed around 200 pounds. To fit the whole of his frame into the box, it required him to sit in as compact a position possible, with his knees pulled tight to his chest. But the size of the compact box was essential. If the container was too large and easily scanned as the kind of box that could comfortably hold a full-grown man, it might arouse suspicion. And that would not do. For the plan to work, the box needed to seem ordinary, forgettable, the kind of crate that would not warrant a second look. That was because it was 1849, and Henry Brown was using this box to escape slavery. At the time, Brown was 33 years old and had lived his entire life as an enslaved person. He had been born on a plantation near Richmond, Virginia in 1815, and from his first moment of life, he had been claimed as someone's property. As he would later comment in his autobiography, quote, "Yes, they robbed me of myself before I could know the nature of their wicked arts," end quote. At the age of 15, he was separated from his family and sent to work at a tobacco factory in Richmond, which was owned by the eldest son of his enslavers. He toiled there for many years, and despite enduring many indignities, he never once tried to escape. This was because Henry Brown was trying to build a life in Richmond. It was in Virginia's capital that he met his wife, a woman named Nancy, who was enslaved by a different family in the city. The two were married and had 3 children together, but keeping the family together was a constant struggle, and the Browns were often at the mercy of the slave owners who were either indifferent to their relationship or were actively extortionary. There was always the threat that either Nancy or Henry could be sold off and permanently separated from the family. In an attempt to keep this from happening, Henry was compelled to pay Nancy's enslaver what he called a yearly rent, but what was in practice more of a ransom. Like many enslaved people compelled to work in factory settings, Henry was occasionally allowed to keep a small portion of his wages. But these meager savings were quickly gobbled up by slave owners who knew how to exploit the situation. Henry Brown was assured that if he kept up regular payments to Nancy's enslaver, his family would be able to stay together. But after fleecing the Browns for a few years, Nancy's enslaver chose to sell her anyway. His promises to keep the family together had meant nothing. Henry Brown's wife and children were taken from him and were shipped to a plantation in North Carolina. He would never see them again. The trauma of this cruel separation would prove to be pivotal in Henry Brown's life. After that day, Brown became determined to leave Virginia forever and begin his life as a free person. But how to do it? In his autobiography, he would describe his plan to escape coming to him in a moment of divine inspiration. Quote, "One day while I was at work and my thoughts were eagerly feasting upon the idea of freedom, I felt my soul called out to heaven to breathe a prayer to Almighty God. I prayed fervently that he who seeth in secret and knew the innermost desires of my heart would lend me his aid in bursting my fetters asunder and in restoring me to the possession of those rights of which men had robbed me. When the idea suddenly flashed across my mind of shutting myself up in a box and getting myself conveyed as dry goods to a free state." End quote. You see, in 1849, after the California gold rush, there emerged a new group of companies who specialized in the discreet shipment of heavy parcels. Gold prospectors had become increasingly paranoid that their shipments of precious metal were going to be discovered, then robbed by inquisitive delivery men. So companies like Adams Express, who operated all over the United States, including Virginia, started marketing themselves as offering fast and efficient deliveries made by incurious professionals. What's more, Adams guaranteed that a parcel sent from Richmond would arrive in Philadelphia within 2 days or less. This was key, because not only was Philadelphia in a free state, it was recognized as a key station on the Underground Railroad. It was the kind of place a freedom seeker could find help and community. So, with this novel escape plan in mind, Brown went looking for people who might be able to assist him. He first reached out to a friend named James C.A. Smith. Smith was a free black man living in Richmond who had contacts with Northern abolitionists. After hearing Henry's plan, Smith reached out to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, whose famous Vigilance Committee might accept this very special package. It was determined that Henry Brown should have himself mailed to the Philadelphia office of one Passmore Williamson, a local Quaker merchant and Vigilance Committee member. From there, Brown convinced a sympathetic white shopkeeper in Richmond to actually send the package. The thinking was that a package sent by a white person would seem less suspicious. Brown ended up paying the shopkeep $86, which constituted half of his total life savings, to cover the cost of the box, shipping expenses, and a little something for the man's trouble. The next question was how Brown would get away from his overseers at the tobacco factory without arousing suspicion. If he could somehow be given permission to miss work, he might be able to buy himself a few days before anyone even realized he was gone. At the time, Brown had a broken finger, which he thought might work as an excuse to miss a day or two at the factory. But when the overseers told him that they didn't think the injury was serious enough to warrant a day off, he decided that desperate times called for desperate measures. He managed to procure a vial of corrosive sulfuric acid, and he poured it on his hand. Brown would remember, quote, "In my hurry, I dropped rather much, and it made it worse than there was any occasion for. In fact, it was very soon eaten into the bone. And on presenting it again to my overseer, I obtained the permission required." End quote. So it was with his hand bandaged and poulticed on March 23, 1849, Henry Brown climbed into the box. He had with him only the clothes on his back, a drinking bladder filled with water, and a small hand tool called a gimlet that he could use to drill extra holes in the box if he needed more air. The lid was secured with leather straps and nails and was emblazoned with the words, "Philadelphia, PA, this side up with care." The storekeeper and James Smith then took their cargo to the office of Adams Express, and the escape was officially underway. Despite the instructions that the crate should be handled with care, the next 27 hours were hellish for Henry Brown. Almost immediately, the crate was turned wrong side up by some careless handlers. In fact, this happened a number of times over the course of the journey, which saw the box loaded onto a succession of wagons, trains, and steamboats. At one point, he was upside down and on his head for over an hour and a half. He would write, quote, "The sufferings I had thus to endure seemed like an age to me, but I was forgetting the battle of liberty, and I was resolved to conquer or die. I felt my eyes swelling as if they would burst from their sockets, and the veins on my temples were dreadfully distended with pressure of blood upon my head." End quote. Amazingly, through all of this, Henry Brown never once cried out or made any sound that alerted any of the handlers to his presence. Thankfully, the box was eventually righted, and the rest of the journey was less horrific. Luckily, Adams Express kept their promise of a speedy delivery, and 27 hours later, Henry Brown's crate arrived at the office of Passmore Williamson. There it was received by a veritable who's who of the Pennsylvania anti-slavery scene, including the famous black abolitionist William Still. The lid was removed, and a disheveled but uninjured Henry Brown slowly emerged. We're told that he greeted the gathered men with a jolly, "How do you do, gentlemen?" before promptly fainting. But if emerging alive from a box was not dramatic enough an entrance, when Henry Brown regained consciousness, he stood up and sang a song of liberation. It was his own personal take on Psalm 40 from the Bible, chosen specifically to celebrate what abolitionists would go on to deem the quote-unquote resurrection of Box Brown. Even after a day crammed in a box, Henry Brown was not going to miss the chance to have a moment in the spotlight. And you can't say he didn't earn it. But the fact that Henry Brown took the time to plan the specifics of his emergence from the box, and even went to the trouble of making a fresh arrangement of a psalm for the occasion, speaks volumes about his irrepressible personality and his innate sense of showmanship. Henry Brown made his escape and emancipation into a performance. It would be a performance he would restage and reimagine countless times over the course of the rest of his life. After making his dramatic arrival in Philadelphia, the Virginian would become famous as Henry Box Brown. His story of mailing himself to freedom immediately became one of the most celebrated exploits associated with the Underground Railroad. Right away, abolitionists recognized just how powerful Henry Brown's story could be in helping further the cause of ending human bondage in the United States. Stories of hair's-breadth escapes that celebrated the bravery and resourcefulness of the people who had emancipated themselves had long been essential parts of abolitionist literature. But Henry Box Brown's story stood out for its sheer audacity, cleverness, and allegorical power. The box worked as an obvious metaphor for slavery itself, and Henry's dramatic emergence in Philadelphia seemed to symbolize the rebirth of all people who had managed to secure their freedom. This was not lost on Henry Brown. who eagerly embraced his new persona as Box Brown. He quickly distinguished himself as one of the most compelling and sought-after speakers on the abolitionist lecture circuit. However, Box Brown was not content to be just another anti-slavery lecturer politely recounting his traumas in sympathetic church halls. He was a showman who wanted to use his story as the basis for multimedia extravaganzas. Henry Box Brown would soon become known for his elaborate anti-slavery panoramas, musicals, magic shows, and mesmerism acts. The box, of course, was always central to this. What had been a novel, if harrowing, means of escape was reimagined by Box Brown on the stage as a potent magician's prop into which someone could disappear and reappear. Henry Box Brown understood that his escape had been spectacular, so why not transform it into a proper spectacle? But Henry Brown's flashy style as a performer eventually put him at odds with much of the wider abolitionist community. There were accepted ways in which people who had escaped slavery were expected to present themselves and relate their experiences. People who had risked their lives in pursuit of freedom were often encouraged to present themselves as either pitiable victims still tormented by the evil institution, or as dignified survivors who sought only to live modest Christian lives as free people. These modes of presentation were believed to inspire the most sympathy from white Americans who might be persuaded to support the abolitionist cause. Henry Box Brown had different ideas about how he wanted the world to see him. His critics would deride his anti-slavery magic shows and musical spectaculars as tacky, flamboyant, and unbecoming of a serious abolitionist. Henry would also have to weather accusations that he was misrepresenting slavery, had lied about his past, and had turned his life story into a burlesque. There were even those who believed that Henry Box Brown's performances were a type of self-serving fake history. So, what should we make of Henry Brown's remarkable life before and after he became Box Brown? How was it that he went from being one of America's most sought-after black abolitionists to being shunned by many of his former allies? His life and art pose the question, is there just one way to talk about slavery? Let's get into it today on Our Fake History. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone listening that you can hear this podcast ad-free through Patreon. Head to patreon.com/ourfakehistory to get access to an ad-free feed and a ton of patrons-only extra episodes. Speaking of which, I'm currently hard at work on the next patrons-only show on the 7 Wonders of the Ancient World. I'm hoping to get that to you soon. So, if you like this show, you want to support us, you want the podcast to continue on forever, then consider becoming a patron. You get a boatload of extras, you ditch the ads, and you get to be part of a community of beautiful history lovers like yourself. This week, we are turning our attention to one of the most fascinating human beings to escape slavery in the American South, Henry Box Brown. It perhaps goes without saying that the stories we have about people emancipating themselves from bondage are all astounding in their own way. The history of the Underground Railroad is filled with countless tales of courage, fortitude, and ingenuity. And yet, the story of Henry Brown has always stood out as one of the more spectacular feats of escape accomplished in the 1800s. Even if you've only ever dipped your toe into the history of the American abolitionist movement, there's still a good chance that you came across the story of Box Brown, the man who mailed himself to freedom. This is because almost immediately after Henry Brown emerged from a packing crate in Philadelphia in 1849, the power of his story was recognized by virtually everyone who heard it. Many modern scholars of Box Brown have pointed out that the symbolism associated with Brown's unique mode of escape is hard to ignore. Brown's escape by Box seemed perfectly tailored to be made into a wider allegory about the institution of slavery itself. In his introduction to a 2002 edition of Henry Brown's second autobiography, the literary critic Henry Louis Gates Jr. explained that, quote, "The perennial appeal of Brown's tale to his contemporaries and to us a century and a half later stems in part from the fact that Brown made literal much that was implicit in the symbolism of enslavement. He descends into what must have been a hellacious passage of the train ride, sweltering, suffocating, claustrophobic, unsanitary, devoid of light, food, and water, only to be resurrected 27 hours later in the heavenly city of freedom and brotherly love that Philadelphia represented." End quote. If slavery was a symbolic death, then Henry Brown's ingenious, if harrowing, escape saw him emerge from what could have been his tomb, born again. The parallels to the Gospels were certainly obvious to religiously minded 19th century abolitionists, and they remain potent to this very day. Historian and Box Brown expert Martha Cutter has described Henry Box Brown's box as both, quote, tomb and womb, end quote, where he both metaphorically died and was reborn. Similarly, the expert Marcus Wood has commented that Brown's journey by Box stood in for the, quote, symbolic entombment of the soul of every slave in a state of bondage, end quote. For Wood, Brown's moment of emergence was, quote, the American spirit emerging from the moral entombment of slavery, end quote. The historian Richard Newman has described Henry Brown's escape as mirroring and ultimately reversing the harrowing middle passage across the Atlantic Ocean experienced by captured African people aboard slave ships. Newman writes, quote, unmercifully packed together in sailing ships, Africans were pressed into enclosures little more than living tombs, non-human products for the commodity market. They were crammed into spaces designed only to maximize numbers and profits. The result was hell, end quote. Henry Brown's trip by Box was similarly crammed, painful, and dehumanizing, but resulted in the start of a new existence as a free person. There's so much written about the mythic power of Henry Brown's escape story that it can be easy to forget that it was a real thing that actually happened. When Henry Brown first climbed into that box in Richmond, Virginia, he likely wasn't thinking, wow, this is going to be a great metaphor. He was focused on pulling off a risky and death-defying flight to freedom. However, One of the things that makes Henry Brown such a fascinating individual is that he seemed to have an innate understanding of how both his life story and his experience in the box could be transformed into political theater. You see, Henry Brown was a performer at heart who used his freedom to express himself as a genre-bending multimedia artist. As mentioned in the introduction, this performative side of Brown's character was evident from the moment he emerged from his box in Philadelphia and revealed that he had a song prepared for the occasion. After traveling 27 hours in a box, some of it upside down on his head, Henry Brown was ready to perform. Within weeks of his arrival in the Free States, Henry Brown was on the abolitionist lecture circuit telling the tale of his remarkable escape to rapt audiences. It's clear right from the start that he understood just how powerful his story could be for the anti-slavery cause. He also recognized that his story made for great entertainment and easily meshed with the rhythms of 19th century stage shows. Henry fully embraced what had undoubtedly been a traumatic experience and turned it into his calling card as both an anti-slavery advocate and an entertainer. Box literally became his middle name, and he used it without quotation marks on all manner of official documents and promotional materials. He wasn't trying to put the box behind him. Instead, he made it an inextricable part of his identity. But interestingly, it's Henry's second and third acts as an abolitionist speaker, panorama creator, actor, magician, and mesmerist that have been the source of more historical controversy. You see, Henry Box Brown used his freedom to reinvent himself as both a political activist and a magical entertainer. But his showmanship and sometimes irreverent approach to his own life story eventually put him at odds with the mainstream abolitionist movement. There were many white abolitionists who wanted to shape exactly how the story of Henry Box Brown was presented to the world. In many ways, Brown had to fight to keep control of his own escape narrative. He was also willing to use that narrative to fuel increasingly elaborate stage shows that featured spectacular unboxings, music, magic, and mesmerism. This led to accusations that Henry Brown was a huckster who was turning the experience of slavery into some kind of carnival. While some saw his shows as diminishing the seriousness of the anti-slavery cause, other critics railed against Henry Box Brown for allegedly exaggerating the horrors of slavery. There were both abolitionists and slavery apologists who had an issue with Henry Brown's unique brand of performance art. So, what are our historical myths that need busting here? Well, experts like Jeffrey Ruggles, Daphne Brooks, and Martha Cutter have done much to enrich the academic understanding of Henry Box Brown. But the popular understanding of this historical figure remains focused on the circumstances of his escape. Those 27 hours in the box. The story of his escape is rarely excluded from any survey of the Underground Railroad or the history of American slavery. But the story of his life after his escape has been largely ignored because it's messy, complicated, and challenges many preconceived ideas about how a black abolitionist should act. The real Henry Box Brown complicates the mythic Box Brown of the abolitionist escape narrative, because Box Brown was interested in developing his own very different myth. So, let's dive deeper into Henry Brown's story to hopefully make some sense of this. Let's pick up with our man in 1849, unboxed and ready to live his life as a free person. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Quince. A thoughtfully built wardrobe comes down to pieces that mix well and last. That's where Quince shines. Premium fabrics, considered design, and everyday essentials that feel effortless to wear and dependable, even as the seasons change. Quince works directly with top factories and cuts out the middlemen. You're not paying for brand markups or fancy retail stores, just quality clothing. I got a chance to cruise through Quince's website, and I got this great lightweight jacket that I absolutely love. I like wearing it, it pairs well with a lot of other stuff I already have, and it didn't break the bank. Quince wants you to stop overcomplicating your wardrobe. You don't need a closet full of options, you just need a few pieces that actually work. Right now, go to quince.com/fakehistory for free shipping and 365-day returns. That's a full year to build your wardrobe and love it. And you will. Now available in Canada, too. Booyah! Don't keep settling for clothes that don't last. Go to quince.com/fakehistory for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/fakehistory. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. The famous black abolitionist William Still has been remembered as one of the most important figures in the American anti-slavery movement. He's been called one of the chief conductors on the Underground Railroad, and over the course of his time as the chairman of the Vigilance Committee of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, he helped hundreds of people escape slavery and start new lives in the northern United States and beyond. In 1872, he published his famous Underground Railroad Records, where he detailed the escapes of 649 different people who ended up connecting with the Vigilance Committee on their journey to freedom. Even in this sea of tales of death-defying escapes, the story of Henry Box Brown still manages to stand out of the crowd. But it's also worth considering that of those 649 people who were helped by William Still, only a handful went on to be abolitionist speakers, and even fewer became nationally or internationally known. Not everyone who escaped from slavery was eager to share their experiences in front of an audience. It's one thing to make an escape. It's a very different thing to become a political activist and a public speaker. But Henry Box Brown was ready for his moment. He was not only eager to tell his story, he also wanted to start performing his songs. In May of 1849, just 2 months after his perilous escape by Box, Henry Brown found himself headlining as a featured speaker at the New England Anti-Slavery Convention. Over the course of 2 days, Box Brown spoke twice to the assembled crowd and gave a performance of the hymn of thanksgiving that he had adopted from Psalm 40 and had originally sang after being released from the box. By all accounts, Henry Brown was a natural storyteller and public speaker. One New England newspaper commented that his talks, quote, aroused a thrill of sympathy and admiration to everyone who listened to his story, end quote. His talk even caught the attention of the venerable black abolitionist and civil rights pioneer Frederick Douglass, who was one of the age's most famous people to have escaped slavery. Douglass was impressed by Henry Box Brown, writing in his newspaper, quote, "What an exhibition! His speech was greeted by deafening shouts, much applause, and a generous contribution to his cause," end quote. Douglas would end up seeing Brown again a few months later, giving a talk at an anti-slavery picnic in Massachusetts. And once again, he heaped praise on Brown in the pages of his newspaper, writing, quote, "Henry Box Brown narrated his hazardous escape from slavery in a box as merchandise marked 'This Side Up,' and that the appeal seemed to reach every heart, even those who had not before been moved by a recital of sufferings and perils peculiar to American slavery," end quote. According to Frederick Douglass, there was something about Brown's story and his way of telling it that seemed to inspire a new level of sympathy among audiences and worked to get more people invested in the anti-slavery cause. Over the next few months, the audiences for Brown's talks continued to grow. In November of 1849, at a talk in Milford, the crowd was so eager to see Box Brown that extra chairs needed to be brought into the venue, and people ended up standing in the aisles. By early 1850, Brown was appearing regularly on the anti-slavery lecture circuit, often with other well-known people who had also escaped slavery, like Ellen Craft and Henry Bibb. Before the year was out, the first autobiography of Henry Box Brown was available for sale. Now, at the time, Brown was likely still illiterate, and as such, the actual writing of this biography fell to a sympathetic white abolitionist named Charles Stearns. Now, pretty much every modern historian who studies Brown has commented on the fact that Charles Stearns was incredibly heavy-handed as a ghostwriter. In many ways, this first autobiography represents an attempt to control Henry Brown's story and force it into a form that would be recognizable and palatable to white abolitionist readers. Not only does Stearns have a verbose style that smothers Henry Brown's voice, he often inserted his own long asides, philosophizing about the evils of slavery. Expert James Only has pointed out that Stearns dresses up, quote, Brown's story in exotic rhetorical garments, so that for every fact there are pages of self-conscious, self-gratifying, self-congratulatory philosophizing, end quote. Ooh, James Only, dropping the truth bombs there. Further, he calls Stearns' prose, quote, overheated and foolish. By the same token, historian Richard Newman has pointed out that Stearns' quote, rhetoric is clear evidence of the kinds of restrictions ex-slaves faced under the control of their best anti-slavery white friends. Unable to read or write, and with little access to printers or publishers, Box Brown was not free from saying what other people wanted him to say. End quote. Newman makes a really good point here. I think there's a way to see the rest of Box Brown's career as him reclaiming the freedom to tell his story the way he wanted to tell it. The Charles Stearns collaboration sold well, largely because the story of Box Brown's escape was so incredible and engaging. People loved hearing the story of the box. But Henry Brown was perfectly capable of telling his own story. And as time went on, he became less interested in telling that story the way Charles Stearns had wanted to tell it. That is, with the type of church sermon solemnity that was deemed appropriate by white abolitionists. It's notable that just 2 years later, a second autobiography of Box Brown would be on the market, which had purged Stearns' florid style and overwrought sermonizing. Most experts feel like that second autobiography is the one that truly reflects Henry Brown's experience in his own words. But the books were always secondary to Henry Brown's stage show. After his success on the abolitionist lecture circuit, Brown started to imagine new and innovative ways to tell his story. Now, it's not exactly clear when Henry Brown became interested in magic, but according to Box Brown expert Martha Cutter, he may have learned an African style of magical performance known as conjure while he was still enslaved in Virginia. She points to an oral account preserved in a pioneering book on African American magicians by Jim Magus, where an informant claimed that he knew Henry Brown in Virginia, and that Brown had learned magical arts from an enslaved man known as Tricky Sam. This same source claimed that as an adult, Brown became known among black Virginians as the area's new Tricky Sam, that is, a magician who did DIY shows for other enslaved people. Now, this story is hard to verify. Brown himself says nothing about it in any of his autobiographies. But if it's true, it would help connect a number of dots. If Henry Brown had a history as a performer, amateur or otherwise, it would help explain why he was so immediately comfortable on the lecture circuit stage. It's possible that he had been doing shows for years. In his autobiographies, Henry Brown presents his idea to escape by box as being sent to him in a moment of divine inspiration. But I can't help but wonder if his experience as a magician may have inspired this disappearance and reappearance in a box. That can't be proven. It's just something to consider. But there's no doubt that Henry Box Brown very quickly wanted to evolve his public appearances into something increasingly spectacular. So it was that by mid-1850, barely a year after his emancipation, Brown created a new state-of-the-art multimedia show called The Mirror of Slavery. This was a moving panorama made up of over 40 huge paintings. Now, 19th century panoramas have come up on this podcast before, but if you've never heard of this art form, then please allow me to explain. Panoramas were giant paintings, usually of landscapes or cityscapes, that were meant to simulate the experience of world travel. The earliest panoramas were painted inside of large circular buildings, where the massive paintings could be observed from different observation decks. A panorama of London was supposed to give the feel of seeing the city from a boat on the Thames. Moving panoramas took this idea and modified it into something close to a proto-cinema experience. An audience would be seated, and huge paintings on a scroll would be mechanically unfurled in front of them. As you moved from scene to scene, it gave you the feeling of traveling to new locations. There would also usually be a narrator there reciting a script that guided the audience on their journey. Interestingly, one of the most popular of these moving panoramas in the 1840s was meant to simulate a steamboat journey down the Mississippi River. At the time, many abolitionists loudly criticized this panorama for softening the image of Southern slavery. The panorama rarely showed enslaved people, and when it did, the effect was such that slavery did not look so bad. The panorama was supposed to be a pleasant and uncomplicated journey. So, slavery was neatly edited out of this version of the American South. Henry Box Brown's panorama, on the other hand, sought to do the exact opposite. He was taking a medium that had been roundly criticized for aiding the whitewash of American slavery and demonstrating that it could be used just as effectively to further the anti-slavery cause. The Mirror of Slavery started with images of West Africa and showed African families living in freedom. The panorama went on to show the capture of African people, their march to the coast, their passage in a slave ship, their sale at auction, and a series of brutal scenes of forced labor and punishment. This was all punctuated with typical panoramic landscapes, beautifully rendered, including the Cape of Good Hope, the Caribbean Islands, Charleston, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C. The second part of the show depicted tales of escape from slavery, including Henry Brown's incredible escape by box. The whole experience was, of course, narrated by Henry Brown himself. The Mirror of Slavery made its debut in Boston, Massachusetts in May of 1850, and quickly found success. By the summer, Brown had taken the show on the road and was displaying the moving panorama throughout New England. This represented a more ambitious and theatrical form of presentation than was typical in the very sober abolitionist world. But newspaper reviews suggest that the wider anti-slavery community was impressed with the Mirror of Slavery and believed that it was good for the cause. The abolitionist newspaper The Liberator commented that, quote, "It is the universal belief here that this novel method of showing up the evils of slavery will do more for the increase of friends to the issue of philanthropy than efforts of a score of lecturers." End quote. Brown's embrace of new media was, for the time, being acknowledged as an effective way to communicate the need for the abolition of slavery. But within a couple of years, the opinions of many abolitionists would change. First, in late 1850, Henry Brown left the United States for England. This choice to relocate followed an upsetting experience where he was attacked on the streets of Providence, Rhode Island. At the time, the Fugitive Slave Act was on the verge of being passed by the U.S. Congress. This was the infamous piece of legislation meant to placate Southern slaveholders that empowered loosely organized posses to kidnap people from free states who they claimed were escaped slaves. In practice, the Fugitive Slave Act not only endangered the people who had managed to escape from slavery, it also imperiled free black people who had been born in the northern states, who often had little recourse if they were wrongfully accused of being escapees. There's no doubt that Henry Brown felt particularly vulnerable, considering that he was someone who had become famous telling the story of his escape from Virginia. Then he was attacked by a group of white men on the streets of Providence. Brown would later claim that these men were actively trying to re-enslave him and had hoped to spirit him away to a ship that was waiting in the harbor. Research by expert Martha Cutter has complicated this story. Police and trial records have shown that the men who attacked Brown were all residents of Rhode Island who were drunk at the time of the incident and didn't seem to have any connection with Southern slaveholders, nor did they seem to know who Box Brown was. So, while these men may have not wanted to re-enslave Box Brown, this was still a hate crime, where a group of drunks attacked a man because of the color of his skin. Brown's later insistence that this was an attempt to bring him back to Virginia may have been a reflection of some entirely justifiable fears. These men may have not planned to capture him, but once the Fugitive Slave Act passed, others like them might have those intentions. The attack underscored Brown's vulnerability. He no longer felt safe in the United States, not even in New England. So he loaded up his panorama and headed to the UK. When he first arrived, the English audiences were very enthusiastic about Box Brown and the Mirror of Slavery. There remained a large abolitionist community in the UK, but perhaps more importantly, since the outlaw of slavery in the British Empire in 1834, wider public opinion had swung in favor of abolition everywhere. In fact, as expert Daphne Brooks has pointed out, many British audiences responded well to Brown's Mirror of Slavery because its focus on injustices in the American South had the unintended effect of flattering the British Empire. British audiences could feel good that, at least in this case, they were on the right side of history. But not every British audience member was enthusiastic. In fact, there were a series of scathing reviews of the Mirror of Slavery that ran in the Wolverhampton and Staffordshire Herald in 1852 that criticized everything from Henry Box Brown's panorama to his personal style. Now, as expert Daphne Brown has quite correctly pointed out, these reviews by an editor named Thomas Brindley, quote, bristle with racial hostility, end quote. The prejudices of the author are right on the surface, but these articles help us understand exactly what it was about Box Brown that rubbed some folks the wrong way. First, Brindley accused Henry Brown of lying about American slavery and condemned the Mirror of Slavery as a type of abolitionist fake history. He would write, quote, it is a very partial, unfair, and decidedly false view of American slavery, guilty of gross and palpable exaggeration, end quote. He goes on to claim that other accounts of these southern states are far less horrific in their representation of slavery, and as such, Henry Brown's Mirror is a, quote, jumbled mass of contradictions and absurdities, assertions without proof, geography without boundary, and horrors without parallel. The representation, to our thinking, instead of benefiting the cause of abolition, is likely, from its want of vraisemblance and decency, to generate disgust at the foppery, conceit, vanity, and egotistical stupidity of the Box Brown school, end quote. The reviewer scolds Box Brown for hurting the cause of abolitionism by, quote, painting the devil blacker than he is, end quote. As the review goes on, it becomes clear that what Thomas Brindley really took issue with was Box Brown's personal style, which the reviewer deemed to be flashy, vain, and a little too rich looking. To underscore this point, Brindley employs a handful of choice racial slurs that I see no need to repeat here. But he notably calls Brown, quote, bejeweled and oily, portly, overdressed, and possessing a, quote, obese and comfortable figure and easy nonchalance, end quote. These are classic racist complaints that still manage to rear their ugly heads from time to time. Brown was being chastised for looking like he had money, for being too comfortable, too at ease, and for possessing a body size that this reviewer believed was undignified. In other words, Henry Box Brown was not conforming to how Thomas Brindley thought an abolitionist speaker and a black man ought to dress and act. Box Brown was not presenting himself in the modest, pious, self-effacing way that some audiences expected from formerly enslaved people. He took the stage with an undeniable swagger, and this particular reviewer was not ready for that. But there was some justice here. Henry Box Brown did not take these flatly racist reviews of his show lying down. He took Thomas Brindley to court and sued him for libel. In particular, Brown challenged the assertion that the Mirror of Slavery exaggerated the horrors of slavery and was a, quote, jumble of absurdities. The English court ultimately agreed with Brown and awarded him £100 in damages for the lost income due to the libelous reviews. So, was Henry Box Brown a purveyor of fake history? Well, the question was tested in English court, and the answer came back a resounding no. The Mirror of Slavery was vindicated. Brown was not a liar, but he was a political performance artist who had the instincts of a circus promoter. As the 1850s went on, a tension arose between his anti-slavery advocacy and his growing career as an entertainer. The lecture circuit had given way to the panorama displays, which easily segued into a full-on career in show business. The reviews from the Herald, for all their ugliness, are helpful for historians because, despite being proved libelous in court, they put in print attitudes about Box Brown that were growing even among abolitionists. Henry Box Brown's swagger and showman's instincts were starting to make many of his political allies uneasy. It seems that while most abolitionists rejected the Herald's assertion that the Mirror of Slavery exaggerated enslavement, some may have worried that Brown's perceived foppery may be hurting the cause more than it was helping. These anxieties would eventually be magnified by a scandal that would force Brown to publicly defend his reputation. So, let's pause here, and when we come back, we will explore what led to Brown's estrangement from the mainstream abolitionist movement. Picture this, it's late at night and you're scrolling through your feeds when all of a sudden you see it, that one product that you've been looking for. You click the link, add to cart, maybe even shop around a little more before finally hitting checkout. As you're filling in your address, you realize you don't have your card anywhere near you. That's when you see it, that purple pay button that has all of your information saved, making checking out as simple as a tap on your screen. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. With Shopify, you can get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you. You can easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. See less carts go abandoned and more sales go with Shopify and their Shop Pay button. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/fake. Go to shopify.com/fake. That's shopify.com/fake. In 1851, while Henry Brown was touring England with his moving panorama, he made the fascinating decision to put himself back in the box. Specifically, Brown started using a replica of the famous box that shipped him from Richmond to Philadelphia as part of his presentations. In many cases, the box became part of his dramatic entrance. Brown would climb into the box, would have it brought on stage, and then he would emerge, reenacting his moment of liberation in 1849. He would usually follow this grand reveal by singing the same hymn of thanksgiving that he had sung in Philadelphia on that fateful day. But in May of 1851, Brown turned this routine into an elaborate demonstration of endurance. He agreed to travel in his box for nearly 3 hours between two of his tour stops, and then was paraded in his box directly to the venue. A local newspaper described it like this, quote, "He was packed up in the box at Bradford at about 5:30 and forwarded to Leeds by the 6 train. On arriving at the Wellington station, the box was placed on a coach and preceded by a band of music and banners representing the Stars and Stripes of America, paraded through the principal streets of the town. The procession was attended by an immense concourse of spectators. Mr. C.A. Smith, a colored friend of Mr. Brown's, rode in the coach with the box and afterwards opened it at the music hall. The box is 3 feet 1 inch long, 2 feet 6 inches high, and 2 feet wide. Mr. Brown's last resurrection, as he calls it, from the box took place at 8:15, so that he had been confined in the space above indicated for 2 hours and 3/4. End quote. This bit of showmanship with the box hinted at the direction that Henry Brown's show was headed. The confinement and then the spectacular reveal followed all the beats of a magic trick. Daphne Brooks has even called this a, quote, inverted magic act of sorts. Brown's recycled boxing altered what would eventually become the classic magic trick of metamorphosis, end quote. Disappearing and reappearing from a box was still novel in the world of stage magic in this period. Escape artistry was also many years away from being popularized. While Brown's act did not involve a miraculous escape, he pioneered the part of the spectacle that involved an act of athletic physical endurance. Scholars of magic will debate who was technically the first escape artist, but one could make the case that Henry Box Brown's re-boxing stunts could count as early examples of the form. But in that description I read above, you might have clocked that the person who released Brown from his box in Leeds was a friend named Mr. C.A. Smith. This was James C.A. Smith, the free black man who had been instrumental in Brown's original escape from Virginia in 1849. You might remember, Smith was one of the people who packed Henry Brown in his original box. After Henry Brown made good his escape, Smith attempted to help a few other people escape Virginia before he was caught by the local authorities. Luckily, a hung jury meant that he avoided a conviction. Afterwards, he made his way north, where he reconnected with Henry Box Brown and became his partner around the time that the moving panorama was being developed. Smith accompanied Brown to England, where, as the description of the box reveal in Leeds illustrates, he remained a key part of the show. But just 2 months after that performance in Leeds, Brown and Smith had a bitter falling out. James Smith would claim that Henry Brown had been cheating him out of his fair share of the profits made from the moving panorama and Brown's expanding anti-slavery presentation. The dispute eventually became public, and Smith accused Brown of being a, quote, showman, cheat, and fraud, end quote. most damning of all was James Smith's accusation that Henry Brown had not been saving money to buy the freedom of his wife Nancy and their children, who were still enslaved in North Carolina. Further, James Smith, who had been the person who originally helped Brown make contact with the abolitionist community, embarked on a letter-writing campaign to a number of well-known abolitionists in the United States and England, decrying Box Brown as a charlatan and a cheat. Smith's letters found receptive ears among many in the abolition movement, who seemed to have already been feeling uneasy about Henry Box Brown's increasingly elaborate stage shows. After this letter-writing campaign, Box Brown essentially became persona non grata among the mainstream anti-slavery activists. This took the form of a quiet shunning on the part of most abolitionists. Few publicly criticized Henry Brown, but he no longer found himself invited to speak at functions organized by abolitionist groups. In the writings of Frederick Douglass, we can see a noted change in how he speaks about Henry Brown by the mid-1850s. As I pointed out earlier in the show, initially Douglass enthusiastically endorsed Henry Box Brown as one of the movement's most engaging speakers. But in one of his later autobiographies, published in 1855, Douglass admonished Brown for, quote, drawing attention to the manner of his escape. He even claimed that, quote, if he had not, we might have had 1,000 Box Browns per annum, end quote. In other words, Box Brown should have kept his escape by Box a secret so more people could have successfully mailed themselves to freedom. Now, it's a reasonable critique, especially when you're operating a secretive underground escape network. But notably, neither Frederick Douglass nor any other abolitionist seemed to think that Henry Box needed to keep a lid on this story back in 1849. On the contrary, most folks, Douglass included, enthusiastically encouraged Henry Brown to share his story of escape, as it seemed to help attract new people to the movement. It was only after the scandal with James Smith that we start to see these kinds of criticisms. But we should ask, how valid were James Smith's accusations about Henry Box Brown? Was he really a fraud who had abandoned his family and was exploiting the serious issue of slavery to make a quick buck? In the book, The Many Resurrections of Henry Box Brown, the historian Martha Cutter has pushed back hard against what may have been an unfair slandering of Box Brown's character. She has pointed out that, quote, there is no evidence against Brown except for Smith's one-sided recounting of this dispute, end quote. Further, her research uncovered an open letter that Brown wrote to a newspaper in England where he publicly defended himself against Smith's most serious allegations. In 1852, a paper in Sunderland, England, repeated Smith's claims that Brown had not been seriously attempting to free his family and was instead keeping the money for himself. Brown fired back a letter where he claimed he had been slandered and that he had, in fact, made many attempts to liberate his family. Now, I'm going to quote directly from this letter. But as a warning, Henry Brown alludes to sexual violence here. Now, it's not explicit, but for those of you who are not in the headspace to hear about that kind of thing, then please skip ahead about 2 to 3 minutes. In the letter, Brown breaks down his version of events, starting with his original appeal for money to aid in his family's release. Now, you'll notice that Brown puts this all in present tense and references the offending Sunderland journalist as Sir a number of times in this passage. He writes, Quote, I appeal to the public for assistance to buy my wife and children. I obtain the money. I offer it. I am refused. I raise more money. I offer twice their commercial value. And the reply of their owner is, you shall not have them. I have tried, sir, and others have tried, and the remorseless slaveholder still holds her and my children in bondage. And before I left the States, behold, my wife gave birth to another slave. Her master is, sir, its father. End quote. According to Box Brown, he made a number of attempts to purchase the freedom of his family, only to be constantly rebuffed by a slaveholder who had sexually assaulted and fathered children with his wife. As Martha Cutter explains, unfortunately, no evidence has been found to help corroborate either Box Brown's or James Smith's story. However, this type of situation, where a slaveholder refused to sell to someone who had escaped slavery and was a known abolitionist, was not unheard of. So, as it stands, historians are stuck with these two conflicting accounts, one from James Smith and the other from Box Brown. In all honesty, both men had reasons to lie. James Smith was a spurned business partner with an axe to grind, but Henry Brown had a reputation to uphold if he wanted to continue as a performer and anti-slavery advocate. It's hard to know who to believe. My instinct is to give Box Brown the benefit of the doubt. But that just might be because I like him as a historical figure. I honestly don't know what the truth is. So, take my opinions here with a grain of salt. What is clear is that despite the fact that Henry Brown had been quietly ousted from the abolitionist lecture circuit, that didn't stop him from continuing his own personal campaign against slavery. He continued presenting the mirror of slavery in the UK until 1863. It was only after the conclusion of the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery in the United States that Henry Box Brown transitioned completely into a purveyor of magical spectacles. In many ways, he finally became the type of unabashed entertainer that he had always clearly wanted to be. Brown went all in on being a proper stage magician, making him one of, if not the, first African-American magicians to perform internationally. Starting around 1864, Henry Box Brown started doing shows that were part autobiographical lecture about his escape from slavery and part magic show. Advertisements from this era always lead with the story of his escape by Box, but then also describe an amazing array of magical feats that the audience can expect. One advert from 1878 describes his act as involving, quote, the astounding feat with the sword and cards, the wonderful flying card and box feat, burning cards and restoring them again, the most wonderful and mysterious doll, inexhaustible hats, the wonderful experiment of passing a watch through a number of boxes, the extraordinary feat of flying money, and the instantaneous growth of flowers. End quote. Now, unfortunately, I have not been able to track down any particularly detailed descriptions of these shows, but it's been noticed that these shows had more than one illusion that featured magical boxes. In this way, Box Brown fully transformed the trauma associated with his escape from slavery into something playful, inspiring, and magical. In this era, Brown also experimented with a number of colorful stage personas. He never fully dropped his Box Brown calling card, but he also started donning an elaborate African-themed costume and presented himself as the quote-unquote African prince. Here, he was posing as faux West African royalty, connected to an ancient African magical tradition. He also performed as Professor H.B. Brown, Doctor of Electrobiology and Animal Magnetism. This fake scientist routine set up his mesmerism act. Now, wow, mesmerism. That is its own wild can of worms. Our friends over at the Constant podcast actually did an amazing show on it a few years back. And I think I may have to tackle mesmerism myself one day down the line. Now, we might recognize mesmerism as a type of hypnotist routine, but in the 1800s, it was coded in a type of pseudoscience and wrapped in a long since debunked theory about animal magnetism. There were many mesmerists at the time who presented their performances as scientific experiments. But Box Brown's mesmerism act seems to have been fairly lighthearted. He called himself the King of All Mesmerists and presented himself as a type of fake expert in the pseudoscience of electrobiology. One description tells us that Brown would have volunteers come up on stage. He would put them into a type of hypnotic trance or a mesmeric trance, and he would have them do ridiculous things on stage. At one point, he would convince his volunteers that they were all sheep, and then he would throw cabbage on the stage and have them comically chomp it up. Now, honestly, this sounds awesome to me. But for a very long time, historians were uneasy with this aspect of Box Brown's life and career. His full embrace of the showman's life after the American Civil War was seen by some as tacky or unbecoming of someone who was once celebrated by the abolitionist movement. This attitude persisted into the early 2000s. In an academic review for the 2004 biography of Box Brown by Jeffrey Ruggles, the reviewer, Sharon Hepburn, commented on Brown's, quote, unfortunate career trajectory from abolitionist hero to Reconstruction-era trickster, end quote. She also commended the author on not, quote, flinching from Brown's depressing descent into a vulgar showman, end quote. Even in the early 2000s, historians were arguing that Henry Box Brown's reinvention as a magician was vulgar and embarrassing. It's not been until fairly recently that scholars like Daphne Brooks and Martha Cutter have reevaluated Brown's later performances as being politically subversive and emancipatory in their own way. Daphne Brooks has argued that Brown's magic and mesmerism shows were profound in that they challenged what was quote-unquote appropriate for African American performers in the late 1800s. In her view, Brown's fearlessness when it came to playing with his identity could be understood as a form of activism. She writes, quote, Brown negotiated alternative forms of self-representation and in turn expanded the terms of Black abolitionist activism, end quote. If true freedom is about being able to live and present as your most authentic self, then Henry Box Brown's unorthodox performances could be seen as the ultimate expression of his autonomy and agency as a free person. Brooks argues that Brown's entire body of work could be seen as a, quote, sprawling epic text, one which Brown, the author, artist, and performer, might leap through, escaping from one art form into the next in his quest for emancipation, end quote. Both Brooks and Martha Cutter have pointed out that every act of liberation in Box Brown's life was, in some way, magical. His original escape from slavery was an elaborate disappearing act that used the beats of a magician's illusion. It only follows that his ultimate escape from the limiting ideas about how an African American can and should act should also come through magic. There's something deeply subversive about a black man standing on stage in the late 1800s and saying, "I have incredible powers," and then using those amazing powers to compel white audience members to comically chomp up cabbage like sheep. The political implications are right there for anyone inclined to read in. As Daphne Brooks writes, quote, "Box Brown harnessed the dark arts of illusion, manipulation, and the spectacularly expedient ruse to cross over into his own singular realm of freedom." End quote. In 1859, Henry Brown ended up remarrying a white English woman, a fellow stage performer named Jane Floyd. The couple would have at least 3 children, many of whom would end up performing with their father on stage. By the late 1870s, Brown's daughter Annie was being billed alongside her famous father for her own magical escape. This was known as the wonderful sack feat, where she would disappear from a large burlap bag. The Brown family eventually returned to the United States in the mid-1870s, before relocating to Canada. After many itinerant years, the family finally settled in my old home base of Toronto, Ontario, specifically in the Corktown neighborhood. Henry Box Brown's family magic show kept on performing into the 1890s, mostly around Ontario, before Henry Box Brown ultimately passed away in 1897. His gravestone can still be found in Toronto's Necropolis Cemetery. I see the life of Henry Box Brown as a celebration of the messy possibilities of freedom. This was someone whose creativity knew no bounds. His creativity powered his escape from slavery. It was an escape so ingenious and audacious that it immediately caught the imagination of anyone who heard about it. As soon as Henry Brown was free, he set about living as a truly free person. That meant pushing the boundaries of abolitionism itself. His moving panorama was a state-of-the-art piece of media that challenged abolitionism's conventional sermonizing. And he wasn't content to stop there. This was a person who took the box that brought him to freedom, which was potentially a painful reminder of past trauma, and transformed it into something joyful, triumphant, even magical. He was irrepressible in every way a person can be. But his work could sometimes be too irreverent for both his contemporaries and even some historians who, over a century later, would dub it vulgar. As Daphne Brooks has explained, quote, "Brown's brash and spectacular public acts may have indeed proved too excessive, too performative, too glam to register as legible acts of social and political resistance to slavery." End quote. I like that. Henry Box Brown was too glam for the 19th century abolitionists. But I would argue that it was that same spirit, that part of him that embraced the glamorous and the magical, that allowed him to free himself in the first place. Henry Brown just kept on freeing himself. In this way, he was magically emancipated. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will be exploring another historical myth. If you had any questions about today's episode, please send them along to me at ourfakehistory@gmail.com, where I will answer some of them on an upcoming bonus episode. If you are a patron, please put all of your questions in the patrons-only chat. I look at that chat first when I am trying to find questions to answer on those bonus episodes. The patrons get priority. Yet another perk of being a patron of Our Fake History. And speaking of my patrons, I need to give some very special shout-outs. Big ups to Hendo Slice, to Brandon Lewis, to Sarah H., to Eero, to Stuart Patrigiani, to Brian H., to Andreas Rinson, or Andre Rinson, to Chris, to Uncle Fudd, to Janet Striano, to Michael Mell, and to Noah Freeman. All of these folks have decided to pledge $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your support. You are what keeps this podcast going. If you want more Our Fake History in your life, you should go to our website, ourfakehistory.com. If you click on the individual pages for each episode, you'll see my works cited list that shows you all the sources that I used to research this episode. You will also find links to our merch store where you can buy cool Our Fake History t-shirts, tote bags, hoodies, and more. You will also find links to all of our social media. I am on Blue Sky at Our Fake History. I'm on TikTok at Our Fake History. I'm making little shorts on YouTube at Our Fake History. I am on Facebook at facebook.com/OurFakeHistory. And we've got an Instagram account where you can see all of Frank Fiorentino's amazing art and all of my fun little reels. That's Our Fake History on Instagram. As always, the theme music for this show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on today's show was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major. And remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
He gave me a book on art forgery. I found myself drawn to these old masters. How did these artists take paint from a palette, arrange it on a canvas? I began to unlock the secrets. I was a storehouse of knowledge of how to create an illusion, present it to a experienced expert, manipulate his mind, and convince him and bring him to the inevitable conclusion that the painting is genuine. We flooded the market with my paintings, and I couldn't believe what I did. I couldn't believe it. Then the dominoes started falling, and eventually the FBI were led to my door. They uncovered a mountain of evidence against me.
But they never actually got you. At this point, you've sold a lot. You've got like $1 million in cash. You sold one painting for $717,000. Why did it go away? Why did you never get indicted? And how are we having this conversation?
I guess that's the greatest story of all.
To hear how Ken Perenni made millions in art forgery, dodged the mafia and the FBI, subscribe to The Jordan Harbinger Show and check out episode 282 in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
Pluto TV has thousands of free movies and TV shows.
You swear?
If I'm lying, I'm dying.
This is the mindset.
Free.
This is the mantra.
Free.
This is the mindset.
With movies like Titanic, Dreamgirls, and Gladiator.
Are you not entertained?
And TV shows like Survivor, SpongeBob SquarePants, The Fairly Odd Parents, and Ghosts. Pluto TV is always free. Huzzah! Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.